Where do we meet if war breaks out while we are at school and you are at work?
Wow.
I just, I want you to sit with that question for a second. If you're listening right now, just let that sink in. Where do we meet if war breaks out while we are at school and you are at work?
It's heavy.
It is incredibly heavy. And, that's not a hypothetical taken from some dystopian sci-fi screenplay. That is a direct quote from a child.
Right.
It was recorded in a recent study by the Red Cross. And they were mapping how global instability is, well, basically impacting families right now.
It really just stops you right in your tracks, doesn't it? I mean, when you hear a child formulate a literal logistical survival plan for a geopolitical crisis,
Yeah.
it fundamentally shatters this illusion we have that global conflicts are, these abstract events happening on a distant horizon.
Absolutely.
It shows that the anxiety of war has permeated the domestic sphere entirely. It's in our living room.
At the dinner table. And that is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. We are looking at this really pervasive, really heavy reality of war anxiety. We've gathered a huge stack of research for this one. We're pulling from clinical psychology institutes, geopolitical forecasting reports, everything. Because we really want to figure out how living in this state of permanent crisis is fundamentally rewiring us.
Right, because it's changing everything.
It really is. So we're going to look at what this constant background hum of global instability actually does to your body, how it alters the way you raise your kids, and then ultimately how it's restructuring the entire global economy.
Which is a massive scope, but it's all connected.
Yeah.
Because, the human brain, from a strictly evolutionary standpoint, is just not designed to consume a 24-hour feed of global catastrophes.
No, definitely not.
We evolved to prioritize threats.
Right.
Like, if our ancestors paid more attention to a beautiful, colorful bird than to the subtle rustling in the tall grass, well, they didn't survive.
They got eaten by whatever was in the grass.
Exactly. So we are biologically mandated to fixate on danger.
So our brains are essentially like threat-seeking missiles at this point. And the modern media landscape is just providing this endless, unlimited array of targets.
Precisely. It's a perfect storm. And we have to look at what that actually does to the individual. Because the Gotthelf Institute, they work directly with the clinical treatment of war anxiety. They provide some really stark data on this.
Yeah, I read that part of the source material. It's pretty intense.
It is. Because this isn't just a vague sense of unease. People are experiencing intense physiological symptoms from consuming news about conflicts that are occurring, thousands of miles away.
The physical toll is actually what really jumped out at me in their research because, you can be sitting on your couch completely safe, doors are locked, the heating is on, you're just scrolling through your phone.
Right.
And yet you feel like you have literally just run a decathlon. Your body is just utterly exhausted.
Yes. And to understand the mechanics of that exhaustion, you really have to look at how the nervous system processes visual information.
Okay, break that down for us.
So when you see a video of a building collapsing, or you get a push alert about a missile strike on your screen, your visual cortex processes that destruction incredibly viscerally.
It feels real.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And your amygdala, which is the brain's alarm center, it doesn't pause to check the GPS coordinates of the video on your phone.
Right, it doesn't say, oh, that's 3,000 miles away, we're good.
No, not at all. It simply registers immediate life-threatening danger.
Wow. So it responds as if that building is collapsing right outside your own living room window.
Exactly. So your body just initiates this massive chemical cascade.
Right.
Cortisol and adrenaline literally flood your bloodstream.
The fight or flight response.
Exactly. Your heart rate elevates, your breathing becomes really shallow, and your muscles tense up. And they specifically mention tension in the neck, the shoulders, and the jaw. Your biology is literally preparing you to either sprint for your life or engage in hand-to-hand combat.
But you aren't sprinting, you're just sitting on the couch in your sweatpants.
Which is the core issue. The physical exertion that is supposed to follow that chemical release, it never happens.
There's no physical release valve.
Right. So you just sit there basically marinating in a highly toxic cocktail of stress hormones. That is why you feel that profound, heavy exhaustion.
That explains the chest tightness, too.
Yes, and the sleep disruption. Your body is working at maximum capacity to keep you alive in a war zone, while your physical self is completely sedentary.
It's like revving a car engine all the way into the red line, but keeping the parking brake completely engaged.
That's a great analogy.
Eventually, the engine is just going to sustain permanent damage. And this leads to some very specific coping behaviors, right? Because People can't live with the engine redlining forever.
No, the system breaks down.
And the Psychiatric Fund, the Danish Psychiatric Fund, they advise people who are calling in day and night just suddenly overwhelmed by this, and they note a major divergence in how people handle this engine revving.
Right. There are two very distinct paths people take.
Yeah, so some people just completely disengage. They delete all the news apps, they log off Twitter, they avoid the news entirely.
Total avoidance. The nervous system simply cannot handle another surge, so it just shuts down the input entirely.
But the other reaction, which honestly seems even more prevalent these days, is the exact opposite. People lean in hard.
They really do.
They develop what the Psychiatrifondin calls safety behaviors. And this is like someone downloading a marine traffic app to monitor cargo ships in the Red Sea.
Right, or compulsively tracking commercial flight patterns over Eastern Europe at 2 in the morning.
Yes. Why do we do that? It seems so counterproductive.
Well, it is a desperate attempt to manufacture control. The conscious logic is basically, if I have enough data, if I know exactly where the troops are and what the analysts are saying on Twitter, I can anticipate the danger.
I can see it coming, so I'll be safe.
Exactly.
But does that actually work? Because the psychologists from our sources, Dam and Westerheim, they point out a pretty massive flaw in that strategy.
Oh, a huge flaw.
They discuss this concept, the central paradox of uncertainty. And it basically says the more you try to eliminate uncertainty by researching a crisis, the more uncertain you actually feel.
It is a brilliant but awful psychological trap because we operate under this false premise that certainty is achievable.
Right.
We think of information as a light illuminating a dark room. Like if I just turn on the light, I'll see what's in here and I won't be scared.
But that's not what happens with global news.
No. In complex geopolitics, more information doesn't illuminate the room. It just reveals how massive and infinitely complex the room actually is.
Oh, wow.
You suddenly realize there are dozens of variables you hadn't even considered. You aren't resolving uncertainty. You are literally just discovering new things to be anxious about.
So the flight tracking app isn't a tool for safety at all. It's an engine for generating new anxieties.
Precisely.
Okay, so if we know the nervous system is reacting to screens like actual physical threats, and we know that gathering more data just makes us feel less secure, how do we override this?
Right, we need a strategy.
Because we can't just unplug from the world entirely, right? That's not realistic for most people.
No, it's not. And this is where Dam and Westerheim introduced the clinical strategy of worry hygiene.
Worry hygiene. I love that term.
It's very practical.
Yeah.
And the cornerstone of worry hygiene is the practice of scheduled worry time.
Right. The idea of allocating a specific, maybe 20 or 30-minute window, say at 5 p.m. every day, strictly for worrying about the state of the world.
Yes, a dedicated appointment with your anxiety.
But I have to push back on the practical mechanics of this. I really do.
Go for it.
Because if I am sitting at my desk at 10 a.m. and I get an alert on my phone about a major escalation in a conflict somewhere, my amygdala fires. My heart rate spikes.
Immediately.
Right. I can't just tell my nervous system, hey, check your calendar. We don't do this till 5 p.m. Like, how do you actually delay a physiological panic response?
That is the critical hurdle. You're exactly right. But the trick is, you aren't delaying the physiological response. You can't. You're delaying your cognitive engagement with it.
Okay, wait. Explain the difference.
This draws heavily on metacognitive therapy. When that alert hits at 10 a.m., the goal is not to suppress the thought or to somehow force your heart rate down.
Which never works anyway.
Exactly. Suppression actually reinforces the thought's importance to your brain.
Yeah.
Instead, you acknowledge the intrusion. You mentally tag it.
Like labeling it.
Yes. You say to yourself, okay, this is a significant global event, and I am feeling anxious about it. I feel my heart racing. But I will give this my full analytical attention at 5 p.m.
Oh, I see. So you are creating a boundary around the rumination, the obsessive thinking, not the initial physical shock.
Exactly. And what metacognitive therapy reveals is that by the time 5 p.m. actually arrives, the physiological arousal, that adrenaline spike from 10 a.m., it is entirely dissipated.
Your body is calmed down by then.
Right. So when you finally sit down to worry, the thought often feels incredibly stale. It has lost its chemical fuel.
Wow.
You basically prove to your brain that an anxious thought does not mandate an immediate drop-everything emergency reaction.
Liza Johnson, she's the head of the Psychiatrifondin's advisory board. She uses an excellent metaphor for this whole process. The train platform metaphor.
Yes, it's brilliant.
I think it perfectly illustrates the mechanics of metacognition. Can you walk us through it?
It's a highly effective Visualization tool.
Yeah.
So you imagine your mind as a busy train station platform,
Okay.
and the train's constantly moving along the tracks, pulling in and pulling out. Those are your thoughts. On any given day, thousands of trains pass by.
Like, I need to buy groceries.
Exactly. Did I respond to that email? What's for dinner?
Yeah.
Most of these trains, you just watch them pass. You don't try to stop them, and you certainly don't jump on board every single one.
Right, you just let them go. But then the anxiety train pulls into the station.
Right. The anxiety train pulls in, the doors open wide, and it practically screams at you to get on.
Yeah.
It tells you that if you don't board immediately and engage with this hypothetical geopolitical catastrophe, you are in grave danger.
And if you step onto that train?
Oh, you are going for a ride.
Yeah.
You leave the present moment entirely. You are no longer sitting safely at your desk. You are mentally living in a hypothetical future where, I don't know, the power grid has collapsed or a global war has broken out.
You're reacting physically to a future that literally hasn't happened.
Exactly. The goal of worry hygiene is never to stop the trains from entering the station. You cannot stop geopolitical news from existing.
The trains will always arrive.
They will. The goal is simply to remain standing on the platform. You observe the anxiety train, you acknowledge its presence, you watch the doors close, and you let it pull away.
Stay on the platform. That is incredibly actionable. I really like that.
It takes practice, but it works.
But earlier we talked about how deeply physical this anxiety is. The muscle tension, the locked jaw. If someone is trapped in that state of physical overdrive, just visualizing a train platform might not be enough to regulate their nervous system.
No, sometimes it's not. And that's why clinical approaches like the ones used by the Gottschalk Institute, they often pair these cognitive strategies with somatic interventions.
Somatic meaning body-based.
Yes. They highlight therapies like TFT or thought field therapy.
Okay, explain how that actually works, because I'm sure to a skeptic, the idea of tapping on your body while thinking about a war might sound a bit, well, disconnected from medical science. What is the actual mechanism there?
It's a fair question, but the mechanism is very much rooted in the somatic feedback loop.
Okay.
When you experience intense anxiety, as we discussed, your amygdala is signaling danger. TFT involves focusing on that specific anxiety while systematically tapping on specific acupressure points on the body.
Like on your face or collarbone.
Exactly. And from a neurological perspective, this physical stimulation, particularly on points associated with the vagus nerve, it sends a competing signal to the brain.
A physical signal that actively contradicts the mental panic.
Correct. So the cognitive brain is screaming, we are in grave danger. But the physical sensory input is saying, we are safe, we are grounded, there is no physical threat hitting us right now.
That's fascinating.
And over time, this physical signaling actually downregulates the amygdala's response. It breaks the loop.
Yeah.
They also utilize connective tissue massage for the exact same reason.
Because of the muscle tension we talked about earlier.
Yes. When your body is locked in a chronic fight-or-flight posture, your physical fascia actually tightens up. Releasing that tissue physically signals to the brain that the danger has finally passed. You have to convince the body it is safe before the mind can follow.
And the urgency of convincing your body that it is safe becomes, exponentially higher when you aren't the only person standing on that train platform.
Right, when there are kids involved.
Exactly. The strategies we just discussed are crucial for individual survival, but they are also the absolute prerequisite for the next major challenge highlighted in the research, which is the intergenerational transfer of this anxiety.
It's a huge issue. Children are constantly watching how the adults handle the anxiety train.
And the data shows they are absorbing it like sponges. The Red Cross study we mentioned at the top of the show, they surveyed parents of children aged 10 to 17.
Right?
And they found that 38% of parents report their children are actively worrying about global crises. War, climate collapse, large-scale catastrophes.
38%.
Yeah, and a significant 12% say their children are highly worried. Like disruptive levels of worry.
Which brings us right back to that devastating quote, a child literally trying to establish a rendezvous point for World War III.
Right.
But we have this really compelling research from the Frontiers in Psychology journal that dissects exactly how this anxiety moves from parent to child. And more importantly, how to sever that transmission.
Yes, the Israeli study.
Right. They studied Israeli families during the early weeks of the Iron Swords conflict.
And the parameters of this study are critical to understand, right? Because this wasn't a survey about abstract, distant fears.
Not at all. This involved 135 mothers and their young children aged 2 to 8 living in central Israel. And they were experiencing daily air raid sirens and actual missile attacks.
So this is acute present tense threat. They were studying a population actively under fire to see how maternal anxiety predicted child emotional distress.
Exactly. And we should clarify, the study focused on mothers as they were the primary caregivers in this specific demographic sample, but the psychological mechanisms apply to any primary caregiver, any parent.
Of course.
So the baseline finding was what you would expect. Higher levels of parental anxiety generally led to higher levels of emotional distress in the child.
Because young children, especially 2 to 8-year-olds, they don't have the cognitive architecture to process a missile siren independently.
No, they don't know what it means geopolitically.
Right, so they rely entirely on their caregiver's nervous system to tell them how to react.
It is a process called co-regulation. Through the mirror neuron system, a child literally synchronizes their emotional state with the adult's. If the adult is panicked, the child's nervous system instantly registers panic. But the immense value of this study lies in the exceptions they found. They identified specific buffering mechanisms that completely broke this chain of transmission, even while the missiles were literally falling.
What were the buffers? Because, I mean, if a technique can sever the anxiety loop during an actual air raid, it can certainly help a parent dealing with the stress of the evening news cycle.
Absolutely. The most significant buffer was a psychological metric called maternal self-efficacy.
Maternal self-efficacy. Okay, what does that actually mean in plain English?
They measured this using a tool called the Me as a Parent scale. And self-efficacy is not about being fearless. That's a crucial distinction. It is a parent's internalized belief in their own capability to manage parenting tasks and support their child through a challenge.
So the data didn't show that naturally calm parents had calm kids. It showed that parents who believed they were capable of handling the situation had calmer kids.
Precisely. For parents who scored low or average on the self-efficacy scale, their personal anxiety directly transferred to their children. Statistically, it was a direct line. But for parents with high self-efficacy, that statistical link completely vanished. Their own internal anxiety, which was high, remember they were in a war zone, did not translate into emotional distress for their child.
That makes me think of like being a pilot flying a commercial jet through severe turbulence.
Oh, that's a perfect way to look at it.
Because the alarms in the cockpit might be flashing, the pilot's heart rate is probably elevated, they are experiencing intense acute stress.
Right, they are not immune to the fear.
But when they pick up the intercom to speak to the cabin, they do not scream. They project an entirely steady, authoritative voice. They say, you know, we are experiencing some rough air. Please remain seated. I am navigating us through this.
That is self-efficacy in action. The pilot isn't pretending the turbulence doesn't exist. They aren't lying to the passengers. They are communicating that despite the turbulence, they possess the competence to manage it. And when a parent projects that competence, they provide the consistent, responsive caregiving that signals safety to the child's nervous system, completely regardless of the external threat.
But, you know, you can't just mandate self-efficacy. A parent can't just flip a switch and suddenly feel deeply competent while reading about global instability.
No, it's an ongoing process.
So how do you actually practice the behaviors that build that efficacy?
Well, the Israeli study identified the second critical buffer, which is entirely actionable for any parent, and that is open parent-child communication.
Okay.
They discovered that the correlation between parental anxiety and child distress was only statistically significant in families who actively avoided discussing the conflict.
Wow. That feels incredibly counterintuitive to the modern parenting instinct.
It does, doesn't it?
Because the overwhelming instinct for most parents is to build a wall. Turn off the television, shield them from the news, just pretend the world is perfectly safe. Let kids be kids.
And yet, the trauma literature is highly, highly consistent on this point. Avoidance is a massive risk factor.
Why is that?
Because children are incredibly perceptive. They read microexpressions. They sense the tension in your jaw. They hear the hushed phone calls from the other room.
They know something is up.
Exactly. And when they detect that severe ambient anxiety in the house, but the adults refuse to explain it, it leaves a huge void. And a child's imagination will always fill that void with something infinitely more terrifying than the reality.
Because a child's imagination lacks boundaries and context.
Yes. By not talking about it, you are basically confirming to the child that the threat is so unspeakably horrifying that the adults can't even vocalize it.
Right. If mom can't even say the word, we must be doomed.
Precisely. When you openly discuss the events, you bound the anxiety. You give it context. You reassure the child that the tension they feel in the house is not their fault and that the adults are actively managing the situation.
But the execution of that conversation is super delicate. You obviously don't sit down and hand a 4-year-old a geopolitical briefing document on nuclear
Ooh,
deterrence.
please don't do that.
Right. And our sources include guidelines from Red Barnet, which is Save the Children in Denmark, and they heavily emphasize the concept of aldersforend communication.
Yes, age-appropriate communication. It is vital.
And the methodology must shift radically depending on the developmental stage of the child, right?
Absolutely. Red Barnet details this really comprehensively. For children aged 0 to 3, for example, communication isn't really about vocabulary at all.
Because they don't have it yet.
Right. They react to changes in their routine and the physical behavior of their parents. They don't understand the concept of a border conflict. They understand that their primary caregiver is suddenly distracted or crying or irritable.
So they might exhibit sleep regressions or become incredibly clingy or start playing more aggressively.
Exactly. And the appropriate response for that specific age group is strictly physical and routine-based.
So no big sit-down talks.
No, it's about reestablishing normal schedules, offering more physical proximity, more hugs, and engaging in repetitive, calming play.
But then you look at the older kids, the 10 to 17-year-olds, the ones asking those really intense logistical survival questions.
Right, a totally different approach is needed.
Because their exposure to the crisis is not mediated by their parents anymore. It is mediated entirely by their smartphones. They're scrolling through unchecked algorithms on social media, viewing unfiltered footage of actual combat zones.
Yes. And for that demographic, Red Barnet stresses validation over false reassurance.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, if a teenager comes to you terrified about an escalation they just saw online, your immediate instinct as a parent might be to dismiss it just to calm them down. Like, don't worry about that. Everything is fine. It's far away. It won't affect us.
Which is just lying to them, basically.
And dismissing it invalidates their reality. They know you're lying. You have to start by affirming the emotion. You say, I see why that scares you. The news is frightening right now. I feel worried sometimes too.
You join them on the platform. You look at the train together.
That's a beautiful way to put it, yes.
And the guidelines from the Danish Health Authority, which are referenced in that Red Barnet report, they suggest a physiological prerequisite before you even attempt to have that nuanced conversation with your teenager.
Oh, this is such a great piece of advice.
It is surprisingly basic.
It is the biological foundation of regulation. They point out that when adults are under chronic stress, we systematically neglect our most basic physiological needs. We forget to drink water. We skip lunch because we're scrolling the news.
And their advice is literally, eat a snack before you talk to your kids about the war.
Yes. Literally, eat a snack. Because the simple physical act of eating and digesting food releases endorphins.
It forces your body to calm down.
Exactly. It shifts the nervous system away from the sympathetic fight or flight mode and back toward the parasympathetic rest and digest mode. You cannot verbally de-escalate a panicked child if your own body is physically starved and running entirely on cortisol.
You have to put your own biological oxygen mask on first.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have spent a lot of time dissecting this on the micro level. We've looked at how an individual manages the physical exhaustion of doom scrolling and how a parent constructs a psychological buffer for their child.
Right.
But individuals and families do not exist in a vacuum. The exact same survival instincts that cause a person to track flights at 2 a.m. or a parent to lock down their household, those operate at the state level as well.
They absolutely do. It scales up.
And when that fear scales up to the level of national governments and global corporations, it stops being just a psychological phenomenon. It becomes an economic engine.
Yes. We're crossing over into the macro shift here, and this is detailed extensively in the Geopolitics Compass 2026 report, which was published by Navigating 360.
It's a fascinating report.
They are mapping a profound structural transformation in how entire societies organize their resources. They introduce this concept of the fear economy.
The fear economy. To understand that, I think we have to contrast it with what we had before. Because for decades, the global market was largely an optimism economy.
Very much so.
Capital flowed toward efficiency, toward globalization, toward the promise that technology would seamlessly connect the world and make everything cheaper and faster. Growth was driven by the pursuit of gains.
Right. Everyone wanted a piece of the upside. But the fear economy flips that paradigm entirely. Growth is no longer driven by the pursuit of gains. It is driven exclusively by the fear of loss.
It's defensive.
Entirely defensive. The report explicitly outlines the sectors that are experiencing explosive structural growth right now: military defense, cybersecurity infrastructure, emergency preparedness, and energy supply chain control.
So the motivation for purchasing has completely changed. Nations and corporations aren't investing in these sectors because they promise a brighter, more innovative future. They're investing massive amounts of capital because the alternative is perceived as an existential catastrophe,
Exactly.
like a cyber attack on a power grid or a blockade of critical supply chains. You aren't buying a product to get ahead. You are buying a shield to avoid being destroyed.
And we must recognize that in the short term, this behavior is incredibly rational. If a hostile actor is actively probing your digital infrastructure, or an armed conflict is destabilizing your energy imports, it is an absolute necessity to invest in defense. It is the state equivalent of a biological reflex.
Right, it's like an immune system responding to an infection.
Yes.
But what happens when that immune response never turns off? Let's use an analogy here. If an economy built on defense and fear is like an immune system, what the Geopolitics Compass report describes sounds dangerously like an autoimmune disease.
Oh, that is very accurate.
The body becomes so hyper-focused on fighting off perceived external threats that it begins to aggressively consume its own healthy tissue.
That is an incredibly apt way to frame the opportunity cost of the fear economy. Because the global pool of capital, political will, and human ingenuity is finite. There's only so much to go around.
Right.
When a massive percentage of those resources is violently redirected into immediate survival mechanisms, into weapon systems, digital fortresses, and duplicating supply chains, just in case society is forced to drastically underinvest in systemic, predictable, long-term threats.
So the healthy tissue being consumed is our capacity to deal with issues like climate change or poverty or our crumbling healthcare infrastructure.
Precisely. And the report makes this stark observation. Climate change is a scientifically predictable, well-documented systemic threat to global stability.
We know it's coming. We know it's here.
Exactly. But in the daily competition for budgetary resources and political attention, climate change consistently loses to the acute, visceral fear of a sudden geopolitical shock.
We are strip mining the future to build a wall around the present.
That's exactly what's happening.
The report phrases it in a way that is really hard to shake. It says a society that exclusively invests in avoiding the worst possible outcome gradually loses the institutional capacity to create the best possible outcome.
You survive, but you stop progressing.
You just stagnate inside the fortress, and inside this new economic paradigm, the rules of business are completely rewritten.
Oh, entirely.
The state, driven by security mandates, basically becomes the ultimate customer and the ultimate regulator. And the report contrasts how this is playing out differently in the U.S. versus the EU.
It is a major divergence in how geopolitical risk is managed, because the U.S. market for these security technologies is characterized by massive budgets, aggressive scaling, and strong centralized political backing.
They throw a lot of money at it very quickly.
They do, but that rapid growth comes with severe strings attached.
Economic dependence becomes strategic compliance.
Exactly. If you are a technology firm building advanced cyber defenses or AI logistics, and you integrate deeply into the U.S. market, you're expected to align with U.S. geopolitical objectives.
You pick a side.
Right. Export controls, subsidies, and security clearances dictate where you can sell and who you can partner with globally. The market is lucrative, but the political volatility is extremely high.
And the EU market, by contrast, is described in the sources as offering basically the reverse. So, slower scaling, more fragmented budgets because of all the different member states, but significantly higher regulatory stability and predictability.
Right. But regardless of the region, US or EU, the core premise for any business has fundamentally shifted. Having the most efficient supply chain or the best underlying technology is no longer enough to guarantee success.
Success is now contingent on political compatibility.
Exactly.
Like, can your company navigate the geopolitical fault lines? Are your data centers located in friendly jurisdictions? Are your rare earth minerals sourced from allies?
And this intense focus on vulnerabilities is driven by the reality of modern conflict. The report uses the term Rovder tactics, predator tactics.
Lizard tactics.
Yes. We aren't just analyzing the movements of infantry divisions anymore. We are talking about hybrid warfare.
And hybrid warfare weaponizes the very interconnectivity that the optimism economy built in the first place, right?
Exactly. It uses our strengths against us. It is the sabotage of undersea data cables. It is the manipulation of energy markets to cause domestic inflation and unrest.
Right.
It is state-sponsored ransomware attacks on municipal hospital systems. In a hybrid war, the front line is literally everywhere. Every sector of the economy, from agriculture to telecommunications, is a potential target.
Which means every sector of the economy requires security.
Yes.
Which leads us to the final, and frankly, I think the most ethically complex layer of our deep dive today.
It gets very dark here.
It does, because this massive influx of capital into the fear economy doesn't just change corporate strategy.
Yeah.
It fundamentally alters the architecture of our democracies.
Yes. The Navigating 360 report introduces the concept of the digital security industry. This is the vast, sprawling ecosystem of public and private entities required to defend against these hybrid threats. It is data surveillance, threat intelligence, algorithmic monitoring. And the ultimate consequence of integrating this massive security apparatus into the core of the state is the potential emergence of this sickerheads democracy.
The security democracy.
Yes.
This feels like the ultimate paradox to me. We build this digital security industry to protect our democratic institutions from authoritarian adversaries. But how does the act of defending democracy actively risk undermining it?
To understand the mechanics of this, you really have to look at how a fear economy inherently operates. Security imperatives demand rapid, decisive action.
Right, if there's a cyber attack, you can't form a committee to discuss it.
Exactly. They demand centralization of data. They require immense surveillance capabilities to detect anomalies before a hybrid attack even occurs. And crucially, they require total secrecy.
None of which align with traditional democratic processes.
Exactly. Traditional democracy is intentionally slow.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Right. It requires comprehensive public debate, transparency, judicial review, and the messy balancing of competing interests. But in a security democracy, those democratic procedures are increasingly viewed as fatal vulnerabilities.
The intelligence apparatus looks at a months-long parliamentary debate over a cybersecurity bill and says, we don't have months, the threat is imminent, we need to act now.
And so the democratic debate is just bypassed entirely. The report warns of a very specific phenomenon: the normalization of the state of emergency.
Yes, I highlighted this part.
What begins as a temporary, extraordinary surveillance measure passed in the wake of a specific crisis slowly becomes permanent law. The exception becomes the rule.
The legal creep. It's the slippery slope, what the report actually calls the glidebane in Danish. It happens systemically because the burden of proof shifts. Once an emergency power is granted, you rarely see a government voluntarily surrender it.
No, never.
Because no politician wants to be the one who lowered the shield right before an attack happens.
Exactly. So formally, the structures of democracy remain intact. You still hold elections, you still have a legislature that meets. But substantively, the state's security apparatus has subordinated the democratic process.
Security ceases to be a tool used to protect a free society. Security becomes the singular end goal of the society itself.
We defeat the authoritarian regime by basically mirroring their methods. We build the perfect, impenetrable digital fortress, but inside the walls, the values of transparency, civil liberty, and privacy have been completely hollowed out.
And history, alongside psychological profiling, suggests that citizens will actually actively participate in this hollowing out.
They welcome it, usually.
Right. When pushed to the extreme, the human instinct will almost always prioritize concrete physical safety over the abstract concept of democratic freedom. Fear is a tangible biological reality.
Like we talked about with the amygdala.
Exactly, but the right to privacy, that is an invisible philosophical construct. It's hard to care about privacy when you think the power grid is going down.
Right.
So consider the choice that the fear economy is subtly forcing upon us. If you're listening, think about this. If you had to choose between living in a society with absolute physical safety, but you are subjected to constant algorithmic surveillance and zero privacy,
Wow.
or living in a society with total democratic freedom, but carrying a high, tangible daily risk of a catastrophic cyber attack taking down your banking system, which do you pick?
It's an impossible choice.
It is, but it feels like the geopolitical landscape is making that choice on our behalf without any sort of public referendum.
And this surrender of autonomy, it connects deeply to a philosophical concept explored in the paper published in the Silo database regarding existential vulnerability.
Yes, let's talk about that.
The text investigates how our fragile physical bodies are basically the primary source of human trauma, but it introduces a framework for our current era: pre-traumatic stress disorder.
Pre-traumatic stress. We are all familiar with PTSD, the psychological haunting of a violent event that has already occurred. But this is the body holding the trauma of a catastrophe that hasn't even happened yet.
Exactly. It is the persistent collective dread that our current societal structures and our biological defenses are entirely insufficient to survive the existential risks we have identified.
Whether it's nuclear escalation, engineered pandemics, or totally unregulated artificial intelligence.
Right. We are living in a continuous state of anticipatory trauma regarding our own apocalyptic scenarios.
The trauma of knowing you are basically defenseless.
Yes, and this pre-traumatic stress is what fuels our desperate willingness to hand over our liberties to any system that promises a shield.
Wow.
But the paper further notes a tragic irony in how we attempt to escape this vulnerability. We try to digitize our lives, moving our economies and our identities into the digital realm, believing it insulates us from physical kinetic threats.
If we're digital, we can't be bombed.
Right. But a digitized identity is just as fragile, just as susceptible to a cyber attack as a physical body is to a physical weapon. The vulnerability doesn't disappear at all. It just shifts domains.
It just changes shape. Well, we have mapped an incredible trajectory today. We started by looking inward, examining the raw biological reality of war anxiety, how the visual consumption of conflict floods the nervous system, causing that intense physical exhaustion and muscle tension while you're sitting perfectly still on your couch.
Right, the engine redlining. And we explored the necessity of worry hygiene learning to stand on the train platform of your own mind without boarding the anxiety train, and realizing the paradox that chasing certainty only breeds more anxiety.
We examine the profound responsibility of the intergenerational transfer, too. How our children are internalizing global fear, and how maternal self-efficacy and open, age-appropriate communication act as the vital buffers against that transmission.
And finally, we followed that fear as it scaled up into the global fear economy, where the frantic pursuit of security is cannibalizing our capacity to solve long-term systemic issues and quietly eroding the foundations of our democracies in the name of safety.
It is a systemic chain reaction. It links the tension in an individual's jaw directly to the geopolitical posturing of global superpowers. We are all searching for a simple diagnosis, a clear X-ray that shows us exactly where the fracture is so we can just apply a cast and fix it.
But there is no single fracture.
No. In a world defined by hybrid threats and chronic instability, the stress is entirely systemic.
Which leaves us with a necessary, if very difficult, philosophical question to reflect on.
Yeah.
If our global economic engines are being driven primarily by the fear of loss and our populations are increasingly defined by a state of pre-traumatic stress, how do we individually and collectively find the courage to build a world that is actually worth living in, rather than dedicating all of our resources to endlessly preparing for the end of it?
That is the question. We'll leave you with that to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.